All right. So today we have our normal announcements going on. I hope you've been paying attention as you came in. I've asked folks to be aware of their environment. Please continue to be aware of your environment. Okay? So these slides are all posted so that you can go back and review them, right? And then today, of course, we have our guest speaker. Welcome to the 2023 Seline Lecture, hosted by the UNL College of Journalism and Mass Communications. And we're honored to have with us today Jenna Johnson, the Deputy Democracy Editor for the Washington Post. And in Johnson's career at the Washington Post spans almost 15 years, during which she has covered several political campaigns and worked with nearly every section of the newsroom. She was the lead reporter for Donald Trump's presidential campaign and covered the Trump White House for over a year. Currently, she leads a team focused on the electoral process and voting rights, managing reporters nationwide and leading collaborations with journalists engaged in democracy coverage. The Seline Lecture, established in 2010, engages journalism innovators and thought leaders on critical industry challenges. Funded by the Seline family in memory of their parents, S. Allen and Kathleen D. Seline, the Seline Lecture is free and open to the public. Today's talk, Deepening Polarization, Rampant Misinformation, and the Erosion of Democracy in the United States, will also be live streamed via YouTube. So without further ado, please help welcome Jenna Johnson.
Thank you. It's so great to be back here. I was a student at the University of Nebraska and in the College of Journalism and Mass Communications. And so it's so wonderful to be back on campus and also very honored to be part of this lecture series. I emailed with Rex Seline a little bit before coming here, and he was telling me about how this lecture got started. And he graduated in the late 70s after working at the Daily Nebraskan, and in the 80s lost his father and was looking for a way to remember him. And when he was a J School student here, he just learned so much from having guest speakers come to campus and talk about their real world experiences and take questions. And so they set up this lecture. One of the things that Rex emailed me is that he said, "My parents had no direct connection with journalism beyond me, but they were deeply committed to their communities and to kids. My father also encouraged his 3 children to take up high school journalism as a way to learn how to write and to better understand news and the world." And Rex's 2 siblings have also contributed to this fund. I really love that because it kind of gets to the heart of something that is very dear to me, and that is, it can't just be journalists who care about journalism. You know, we need everyone to care about journalism. We need them to support it and to share it, to understand how we do it and why we do it, and to defend our work, and to be able to see the differences between journalism that's fact-based and journalism that's running with an agenda. So I know some of you in the room are looking to become journalists in your careers. And so I know you are probably very interested in things that I'll be talking about. But for those of you who do not want to be reporters or editors, I hope that you come away from this with just an appreciation for journalism. And that's something that you're going to take with you for the rest of your lives. So let's talk about polarization, disinformation, misinformation, and democracy. Like we were saying, I have been at the Post since I graduated UNL. I started on our local desk covering local news. I covered the Maryland State House and higher education. And then in 2015, I moved to our national staff to cover the presidential election. And I was covering Republican candidates who were running for president. And one thing that really struck me as I was out on the campaign trail. And I know this sounds really naive looking back, but I was really struck by just how many people I came across who just kind of hated journalism and hated journalists and hated journalism the way that the Washington Post does it. And, you know, I was well aware of the fact that there was decreasing trust in journalism. I was well aware of the criticism of journalism that's been out there. You know, that we've overcovered some communities and undercovered other communities, that we've overcovered some issues and undercovered other issues. I grew up, my parents were both journalists, so I was well aware of, you know, how editorial boards could be very polarizing. But for much of my life, it kind of felt like a lot of Americans would disagree on how they felt about different facts. But then we all kind of agreed on the same facts. And, you know, when I was out reporting on the campaign trail, and then the years since then, my eyes were very wide open to the fact that many Americans had totally different ideas on what the facts were. You know, we couldn't even really figure out what we agreed on as being the facts. And that this country was just becoming more and more polarized. That depending what your political leanings were, you woke up in the morning and got your news from a certain set of news sources. You know, as you were searching on the internet, different things would get pulled into your findings. As you were on Instagram and Twitter, other thoughts would kind of enter your sphere. And that what you were seeing could be completely different than what your next door neighbor was seeing. And that this was kind of creating a world in which we were all kind of operating with different facts. And there's also a lot of people in this country who can't really make sense of any of it. And they're kind of overwhelmed by it all. And they don't have the time or energy to figure out what's right and what's not right. And they're just living their lives. And all of that gives us a really interesting moment in history. At the same time that we've had this polarization happening, we've also seen just an explosion in the amount of misinformation, disinformation, and just straight up wrong information that's out in the world. You know, maybe it's on a website that you've never heard of, but it looks really official. Maybe it's in a Facebook post. Maybe it's showing up on your phone in a WhatsApp chat. You know, but kind of as the years went on and I was covering the 2016 election, the Trump White House, the 2018 midterm election, the 2020 election, I was just kind of stunned by all of the different things that people were hearing that weren't based in fact, and they weren't quite sure where to go to make sense of it all. That brings us to the 2020 election. And you know, coming out of that election, you know, a lot of Americans didn't feel like they could trust the outcome. They were told they shouldn't trust the outcome. They shouldn't trust the voting process. They shouldn't trust what was happening. And enough of them felt strongly enough about that that they stormed the US Capitol and tried to hold up the transfer of power from one president to the next. In the days after the January 6th attack, a good friend of mine who was an intern with me and went on to be a war correspondent, spending some time in Kabul and other war zones, reached out and said, hey, a bunch of my friends who I know from Afghanistan and elsewhere and work for foreign media companies are flying to the United States to cover what's happening there. And they want to talk to you about where they should go in America to understand what's going on and why it's happening. And in those conversations with citizens of other nations watching what was unfolding here, really crystallized for me what's been happening in this country and what's been happening to our democracy, what's been happening to our relationships with each other. The Washington Post a year ago actually formed a democracy team to really tackle these issues. We write a lot about voting. If voting laws in a state are changing, we write about them. We help kind of figure out things with voter ID, mail-in ballots, changes in ballot drop boxes, and things like that. We also have reporters who go out and report on polarization, report on just how people feel about the country in this moment, and why it is that they don't trust the way that voting happens. We also do a lot of fact-checking. We do a lot of explanatory journalism. When something is happening in the news that can really be hard to wrap your mind around, we do pieces that break it down for people and try to make it easier to understand. So the big question that I'm sure a lot of you ask yourselves if you're in J school classes, and I know a lot of us who work in journalism are asking is, what do we do to change this? And that's a big question. I don't have all the answers. I figured I'd just list off some of the things that I personally am doing to try to address this. I think a big one is that we need to be really clear-eyed on the issues that we're reporting on. We need to take in various points of view on them, but we also need to be careful not to elevate facts that are not based in fact to the same level as the actual facts of the case. I think that we have an opportunity in journalism right now to educate people, to break things down. With my own reporters, I try to be radically transparent in our writing to tell people how we did our research, why we did our research, why we're writing the stories that we're writing, what they mean. We've started adding some context boxes to some of our pieces that kind of describe some of that process to demystify it a little bit. We also are trying not to wait for people to come to us. We're trying to get out on other platforms, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Our reporters will go on cable television, local television, radio stations, just to try to get out into new communities that we haven't been reaching yet. And I also think that, each time a reporter, when I was going out and talking to people, I felt like each reporting trip was kind of an opportunity for me to not just report the story that I was doing, but also just kind of be an ambassador of journalism, to go to people and to ask what they think, to get their input, to get their thoughts on how we were covering things and why we were covering things. And for those of you who are not going to have your careers in journalism, you can be part of that ambassadorship. You can be part of, when someone at Thanksgiving dinner is saying something that doesn't sound quite right, to put them in touch with coverage that can, help them see what the facts of the case are. So that's a little bit about my career, my job right now, the world that I'm really focused on right now. But I really wanted to leave as much time open as possible to just have questions and to hear from you what you guys want to talk about. So with that, I will throw it open.
Great. Now I have selfishly a few questions that I'd like to ask.
Yes, go for it.
Now our class, we have looked and studied at the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, the SPJ. How has the Code of Ethics been a part of your career as a journalist? And in going through and watching all of these polarizing moments where there's differences in opinion, where people's ethics might be a little different than another group's ethics, how has that worked into your space?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's, doctors go to medical school and get a medical license. So many careers, you have to have a license to do what you do. Journalists, I mean, we're bound by our ethics. That is why if we do something unethical, readers then have a reason to not trust us. And so we have to hold ourselves to the highest standards. We have to hold our work to the highest standards. When we make a mistake, and we make mistakes, we need to correct it. We need to be upfront about why we made it, and we need to communicate that to people. I mean, the thing that has been challenging is that even when you are holding yourself to the highest ethics, sometimes that doesn't matter to people. Like there are a lot of people out in America right now who don't necessarily want, nonpartisan ethical journalism. They want to read things through a partisan lens. They want to be presented with the facts that confirm what they believe and don't challenge what they believe. And listen, there's a lot of room out there for a lot of different types of journalism, but there's a real need, a real public service need for journalism that is objective, straightforward, nonpartisan, and now more than ever, we have to hold ourselves to those standards.
And then my second question, now that I've asked you an industry-related question, I'm going to ask you one that's more for your personal life.
Okay. Dear. Here we go.
Yeah,
okay.
I promise. Have you ever been given a piece of advice, and if so, that you knew immediately when you heard it that it wasn't the best piece of advice for you? And if so, how did you know intuitively to go around what somebody else was telling you to build your own path?
That's great. That is a great question. I mean, this comes up every day in my career. Just to make my answer as more personal than work related, I have a 2-year-old, and when I became a parent, someone gave me advice that when you become a parent, you will receive tons and tons and tons of advice from everyone, and you have to pick and choose which pieces you actually want to follow. And not all of them are actually going to apply to you and your kid. And at the end of the day, you need to trust your gut on what sounds right and what you, what your true north is telling you. I mean, in your careers, and I'm sure a lot of you are already experiencing this even in college, I've been very blessed to have many different types of mentors across my career, but every mentor, every professor, every boss in your life is going to give you advice that comes from their own experience. And a lot of times they'll try to steer you towards what they like doing and what they want to do. And you just kind of have to take it with a grain of salt. You have to kind of trust yourself on things. A lot of times when reporters come to me and are asking, I'm doing this beat right now, I'm thinking about doing this other beat, but if I do this other beat, that might help me get to this beat, and what do I do? And my advice to them is often like, what do you want to be doing in this moment? If you're happy in this moment, if you're doing something that you're passionate about, it's going to be a better experience, your work is going to be better. So focus on the job you're going to be in right now. And what are you passionate about? What sounds the most fun to you? What sounds the most rewarding to you? And if that's an option, try to do that, or try to find a way to set it up so that can be a part of your life.
Nice, thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and have Austin go around, and please speak and use the microphone, okay? So if you have a question, please make sure that you raise your hand, all right? And Austin will go.
You kind of already answered this, but do you think that opinion-based journalism qualifies as journalism, and do you think that there needs to be a stricter point or telling people that it is opinion-based journalism?
Yeah, totally. I mean, first of all, there's totally a need for opinion-based journalism. You know, at the Washington Post, we have the newsroom where reporters are not allowed to have their opinion. You know, like, we are running at what the story is and what the facts of the story are, and what your personal beliefs are really need to mostly be set aside in pursuing that. But we also have an opinion staff, and it is their job to have opinions. And they're experts in figuring out what to tell people about the news of the day and to how to feel about it and a way to look at it. And we have we call it like a firewall between those two desks. They do their thing. Sometimes what they do makes it difficult for us to do our jobs. Sometimes things we do in the newsroom make it difficult for them to do their jobs, but we don't coordinate, you know? We do totally different things. We report to totally different bosses. It gets tricky when those worlds start mingling elsewhere. And there's a time and space for both of them, but I think we have to be radically transparent. I mean, one of the things that at the Post that we've been working on over the years is just better labeling opinion content as opinion content. You know, is it enough to have like the tiny little words opinion at the top? You know, if we say editorial, do people know what that means? They just see that it's on the Washington Post website. So are there things that we can do to be more transparent in labeling that content on our website? You know, other news outlets elsewhere, you know, might take a different approach to that. But I think that we, you know, whether it's this or, I just think any writing you're doing anywhere, it's good to remember who's consuming it, you know? And a lot of times when I'm editing a piece, I think, okay, if a dad is reading this story on the sidelines of their kid's soccer game, you know, or a grandparent is reading this story while waiting in the car to pick up their kids, you know, their grandkids from school, and they're reading it on their phone, are we giving them enough context? You know, like, are we signaling to them what this story is, what it's about, how it was collected? And I just don't, people are busy. And I think as much like transparency we can have with them and context we can have with them, I just don't think we can do that enough.
Thank you.
Great question.
You talked about, you know, somebody, maybe a dad, reading the paper on the side of a soccer game. So people may be skimming, they might not be deep reading. So how big of a role does diction play when you write or you edit?
I'm sorry,
how big of a role does diction play when you write or edit a story?
Yeah, I mean, so many people don't even read past the headline, right? You know, so often you'll see a story quickly getting dragged on Twitter, and no one's clicked on the story yet to read past the headline. You know, within the story, you know, I just think that, like, you know, paragraphs, you know, like keeping paragraphs moving quickly and short so that they're not having to scroll 8 times before they get to the next break and can just mentally catch up with what they've been reading. You know, to use quotes that really add emotion and color to a piece instead of, you know, just recounting what was in the paragraph above. I just think that we really have to keep in mind the reader experience, whether they're reading it or if they're hitting the audio function and they're listening to it, that it makes sense, that it flows, that it keeps moving, in hopes that they will stay with the piece to learn all of the information that we've gathered for them. I hope that answers your question. Oh, good.
First
Yeah.
of all, First, I'd like to say thank you for coming in and spending this time with us.
Of course.
My question is, with TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, many of these social media platforms that are now global, how do we deal with that, with the information that is either misinformation or disinformation being transferred among people globally?
Yeah.
Because different countries have different rules on information, of course.
Absolutely. Such a good question. I wish I had the answer. There are people much higher than my pay grade just at the Post and also across our country and across our world who are, addressing this question right now. I think one lesson that I have learned through all of this is that misinformation is going to find its way to people. Various different platforms have put in some monitoring. Different countries have different approaches to what you can legally say and not say. But at the end of the day, stuff travels word of mouth. Stuff travels over WhatsApp conversations and Facebook direct messages. And I think that one thing that we need to keep in mind is just that it's out there and that it is spreading and that it is changing the way people view elections, how they view their country, how they view their leaders, how they view different issues. And we can't just ignore it. We can't just say, well, that's just like a viral thing, we're just gonna ignore it and act like it's not happening. I really think we need to take an active role in confronting it, in debunking it, in being on those platforms and offering some context. Again, there are a lot of people out there who, might not necessarily want that context, who might want to kind of continue believing the facts that they want to believe. But I really do think that a vast majority of people want that guidance, want that context, want that explainer on what is wrong with this, what is not factual about this, or why we don't quite know what the facts of this are, but here's what we do know. So that's why just on my team, we've been doing a lot of work on explainers, on fact checks, on doing vertical video, when a big news moment is happening, having our reporter film a vertical video talking through what they've learned, and just getting that information off of our website and into different media streams that are out there. I hope that answers your question.
It does.
Okay, thanks, great question. These are all great questions. Your students ask brilliant questions. You were right.
I have a group in here of thinkers, and they really work hard to, you notice they've been writing their questions beforehand, and they're ready. They're excited that you're here, so thank you.
Good. Who's next? Oh, looks like one over here.
What do you think is the biggest issue in our industry today? The biggest problem within journalism?
Oh man, just one? The biggest one?
What do you think because obviously it's a flawed system just like everything else, but what do you think before we can get to other stuff, the first thing we need to address would be?
Yeah. Okay. As I quickly think on this, because this is a really question, what do you think the biggest problem is right now?
I'd probably say just integrity and having a sense of putting it back in perspective of we're doing this to inform others, not for our own personal gain or interest. Our first duty is to the people.
Yeah. No, this is such a good question. I guess I would just say the thing that I struggle with the most is just the volume of information that's out there. I can't read everything that my news organization writes every day. I can barely read everything that my section of my news organization writes every day, let alone hundreds of other news organizations doing just as much work, let alone thousands of other pieces of information that are ping-ponging around the globe right now. Like, we're in this moment of, when I was a kid, not that I'm that much older than you, but the Lincoln Star and the Lincoln Journal landed on our doorsteps twice a day, and then the Lincoln Journal Star landed on our doorstep once a day, and there was the evening news. And if you could afford cable, there was cable news, And now, the media landscape has just exploded, and there is just so much information out there. And I work in this industry, and I struggle with what's the best way for me to get read in every morning? Like, how should I do this to stay on top of everything that's out there? And if I struggle with that, I know readers are struggling with that too. And so I think that just making sense of the massive volume of information that's out there, and when you have such a massive volume, it's easy for just lies to take off, because everyone's so overwhelmed, they don't necessarily have time to figure out what they believe or don't believe. With that said, one of the things I'm really keeping my eye on is AI. And for many, many, many years, we've been dealing with deep fakes, and as a journalist, we would get training in how to spot deep fakes and how to be careful not to retweet stuff that's not based in fact. And it is getting more and more and more sophisticated very, very, very quickly. And I think even now, I've always had kind of a heightened sense of, and this is good, journalists should have this heightened sense of, anyone could be trying to mess with me at any time, and so I need to deeply fact check everything, and anyone could be trying to pull a fast one on me, and so I need to be really, really careful. But you add this AI stuff on top of that, and I think a lot of people are we're going to hit a point where it's going to be increasingly difficult to tell what's the real world and what's a computer-generated world. And we need to figure out strategies for how to navigate that. And that is something that we are talking about and thinking about and trying to figure out how we're going to navigate that. Excellent question. Thank you for making me think.
So it says that in 2013 you spent weeks on the Syrian border in southern Turkey. I was just wondering, how was their media viewing, refugees, immigrants, all that stuff, compared to how, the U.S. compares, or how the U.S. covers, immigrants, refugees from, Mexico, South America? Yeah,
absolutely. A little background on this. In 2013, I was on our local desk, and it was right when the Syrian civil war was starting. And they were looking we always wanted to have one or two journalists in the region. At the time, it was because we thought Bashar al-Assad's regime could fall at any moment, and that we would need to kind of rush in and cover what happens. Not what ended up happening. So I spent 6 weeks in southern Turkey, in Antakya, a city that has since been completely destroyed by an earthquake. Which has been really difficult to watch, talking to refugees as they were coming in from Syria. This was early in the conflict, and so there were definitely waves of refugees who were coming in, and it was starting to hit the point where a lot of Turks, didn't want people camping out in their streets. I mean, all of the extra apartments had been filled, like all of the extra space had kind of been filled, and they were starting to hit a point where, animosity to refugees was starting to set in. But with that said, it was still welcoming. And having covered that experience, that was really a pivotal part of my career. Just talking with people who were trying to wait out this conflict. And, there's one family I talked with, a bullet whizzed over their daughter's head. And that was the moment that they had to pack up and leave and get out of there and get over the border. It gave me a lot of insight into refugee moments, especially for refugees fleeing violence. But I also covered the Trump White House, and at a time where they, were putting in very strict rules along the border, where his rhetoric was, very, very anti-immigrant. And that is just, it was, really unprecedented and much different than what, not to say that Turkey wasn't unwelcoming, and not to say that there weren't problems that were similar, but what happened in the United States starting in 2016 was really, really different, I thought. Yeah.
Hi. So I had a question. We learn about the basics of interviewing and how to quote people in our classes, but are there any unspoken rules or guidelines during the interview process while interviewing people like politicians or celebrities or just people in the public eye?
About what you quote them on and things like that?
Yeah, or just the interviewing process and how that feels. Oh, sorry. Interviewing with people in the public eye. What's that process like?
Yeah. I guess that's a really good question. I guess my guidance, just to kind of take a slightly different turn on this, would be people in the public eye know what the rules are, and a lot of what you do as a reporter is negotiate on those rules. So, especially people in politics will want things to be on background or with their name not attached and things like that. And you're just constantly pushing to say, no, put your name on it, the thing that I worry much more about is when you're talking to everyday people, especially people who are talking to you in a very vulnerable moment of their lives, and they're putting themselves out there. And they're putting themselves out there at a time when others can be so cruel. And when someone puts themselves out there to share their story, they can be attacked for it, they can be targeted for it, they can be doxxed for it. And so I think that we need to be very mindful of that and to make sure that they understand what they're getting into. Make sure that they understand what could happen and what could come their way. And to make sure that they're also really, a lot of times I'll kind of check back in with them and say, hey, like I said, I'm doing this story. I'm planning on, quoting you in the story, and I'm focusing on what you were saying about this, this, and this. And sometimes hearing it back, they'll be like, well, that's not quite how I feel, Giving them that chance to make sure that they really understand what they're being quoted on, how their stance is being presented to the world, making sure that you've properly understood where they're coming from, because it's a big risk for people to be doing that. Yeah.
Hi, this is Fatma. I'm an Afghan student. Based on my experience back home, we were extremely struggling with accessing to information. It was a serious and major issue in Afghanistan. So I'm asking, is accessibility to information a concern for the American journalists or media? Or no, this is something very easy to access the information that is required? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and welcome to Nebraska. I'm so happy that you are here. Yeah, we, in some ways, the United States has a history and a culture of transparency and of access to public information, and of being able to ask your government officials questions and being able to challenge them and things like that in ways that just do not exist in other countries. But with that said, we've also seen in the United States, especially over the last 10 years, states that are rolling back what's considered public information and trying to, closing off press conferences to people, making it more difficult to get things, violating open meetings laws, getting rid of public comment sections at government meetings and things like that. So, one thing that the Washington Post does is that we're always looking for opportunities to push for more. That when we file Freedom of Information Act requests and it gets denied or pushed back or they're not fulfilling it, we really try to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. Sometimes joining other media outlets to file lawsuits to get information and access to things. It's definitely, and we are a national news organization and we have the resources to do that. In a lot of small communities, similar things are happening, and that just means those communities don't know what's happening and how decisions are being made and how money is being spent and things like that. Just as one example, on Monday, the trial, Dominion versus Fox News. Dominion, which sells election equipment, is suing Fox News for spreading misinformation about Dominion and about its role in the 2020 election. And this court hearing will not have video, and it will not have a public audio feed. So unless you show up and are in the courtroom, you don't get to watch what's unfolding. And that is one small example of where it's on journalists to figure out what's going on in that closed room and tell the world about it. And it's meant that we've had to dedicate many more reporters to that story than we normally would, because it's going to take an army of people to communicate what was going on in that room. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Hi.
So I just want you to, could you comment on, so we have American adversaries who have full-time teams whose job is to push out disinformation to really undermine faith and democracy. Some countries like Finland and Sweden have started misinformation education for elementary school students, for secondary students, as a part of them being able to see that. Is that something that you think would work in the United States? And what's the line there between that kind of training or education and free speech?
I think that we, in the United States, across the board, we do not do enough work to educate people on basic civics. How things work, what their role is as a citizen, how to assess information that's coming in. And it's inconsistent. you know? Because the way the United States is structured, we don't have a national curriculum. You know, school districts can decide if they want to teach that or not. And some have decided that in educating students, that's an important part of what they need to be citizens. But I mean, even when a major news event is going on that involves Congress or the Speaker of the House or the White House or different things like that, go look at Google Analytics and look for what people are searching for. People are seeking out how this works. They don't necessarily, you know, and maybe they heard it once in 4th grade, but they haven't heard it since then. And I think that we can all play a role in just better understanding how things work. And, you know, the media can play a role in explaining that to people. Again, getting back to context, we've been trying to add some of that context into stories. We don't want to slow down our super readers who are political wonks and nerds and like want to fly through stories and not have to read what a Speaker of the House is, but we want to put some context clues in there that help people understand that.
Okay, Jenna, let me just come in.
Yes,
here
yes.
quickly. I think the world generally looks at the United States as maybe, you know, as far as democracy is concerned, as the beacon of democracy. In the wake of recent events before President Donald Trump left office, we had what many described as an insurrection. Recently, we've had court cases and all of those. Do you think that the United States still occupies that very revered position of, you know, leading democracy in the entire world? That's one part.
Yeah, yeah.
The other part of my question will be, I mean, we have a lot of young folks here who probably are saying, okay, how did you get from this room as a UNL student to where you are today, you know, at the Washington Post? Maybe you want to look at those too as well.
Yeah, no, great questions. So on the first one, like, listen, like, you know, there are many ways in which democracy in the United States is eroding or has eroded, but it does still exist and it can still be strengthened. And there are actually a lot of people out there who are working to do that, especially at a local level in their own communities. You know, but with that said, I think a good example of this is the Carter Center in Georgia. So Jimmy Carter, when he left the White House, founded the Carter Center and basically set about to travel the world, help solve conflicts, bring peace, improve health incomes, and you know, in doing that work, you know, monitored elections in many countries. He said that he learned that for there to be peace and for people to be healthy, they have to have a say in their government. And so, you know, he and his team really worked on doing that work. In the last few years, the Carter Center has started doing work in the United States. They, ahead of the midterm elections, were doing, asking candidates to pledge to accept the results of the races that they were running in. They've been training people to help monitor elections and to step in if people are being blocked from voting or being intimidated from voting and things like that. And Carter Center officials were, you know, they had some trepidation in doing this work because in some ways, you know, allowing access to the polls can sometimes be seen as a partisan issue. And even though Jimmy Carter was a Democrat, he really tried to make the work of the Carter Center be very nonpartisan. So I see that as just like a really good example of what has been happening here the past few years. And then as far as my path, while I was at the University of Nebraska, I worked at the Daily Nebraskan, maybe too many hours at some point. I did internships each summer, first at the Norfolk Daily News, then at the Omaha World Herald, then at the Des Moines Register. And if you're looking to be a journalist, get experience, just get out there and report stories and see if you like it or not, because maybe you don't like it and you want to kind of reevaluate what you're going to do. But I've made a lot of mistakes over all of those years. I've learned from those mistakes. I've been lucky to work with really amazing editors and fellow reporters at all of my internships and now at the Post who have taught me so much. You get such a great foundation here in college, but journalism is just one of those things where you continue to learn. And I'm still learning how to do this. Every day I'm learning something new. So, my big advice would be, just to get experience, to get out there and do it.
Hi, Jenna. Sorry, I'm going to ask a question, and the question is this. Ben Bradley more or less made the national he made the Washington Post into a national medium through Watergate and so on. And then you had Marty Baron, Democracy Dies in Darkness. He was a major player during the Trump era in making the Washington Post really relevant to the upholding of the democracy. If you were to make a prediction, what do you think Sally Busby will become sort of synonymous with a banner headline for?
Oh my goodness, what a question. Just to help catch everyone up too, Marty retired, I guess about 2 years ago, and Sally Busby, who had been at the Associated Press, came to the Washington Post, has been making all sorts of changes and kind of figuring out what her headline is going to be. So who knows what that will be? There are many more years left for her to figure that out. But for right now, one of the big things that she has been pushing on is to make the Washington Post more than just politics. We've always been more than just politics. But what people think about us for is our Watergate coverage, our coverage during the Trump administration, our ongoing politics coverage over the years. But we also have a phenomenal sports staff. We also have a brilliant features and style team. We do amazing local reporting in an area where the DC metro area runs from Washington, DC to Maryland to Virginia. One thing that she's done is built out a whole wellness team that does reporting on all of those questions we find ourselves Googling, like is coffee or tea better? What health decisions should I be making? How should I be dealing with the stress of this moment and things like that? We've also, in recent years, we created the democracy team. We created an entire desk that runs that climate coverage. We've dramatically grown our tech staff to cover everything that's happening in the tech world these days. So who knows? I don't want to put a headline on it for her. But I think that what she's communicated to us is that she's looking for us to be, just as we're so well known for politics, to be so well known for all of these other great things that we do. Yeah, great question.
Hi, I wanted to ask about how do you use the backlash you get from being a journalist and turn it into something constructive?
That's a good question, and not just cry. Yeah, no, backlash can be really, I joke about that, but I don't want to diminish the backlash. It can be really intense, especially in the years that I was covering a campaign and the White House. You're very much in the public eye. You're doing work that is read by many people, and that can lead you open to all sorts of really nasty, really terrible attacks. One of the things that my editors really instructed me to do in those moments is that it can be easy to freeze up. It can be easy to say, like, I'm just going to sit here and scroll through all the Twitter hate for the rest of the day, and or I'm going to let it get me really mad, or I'm going to let it get me down, or and the advice that my editors kept giving me, including Marty Barron, was just focus on the work. Don't let this get you off your game. The work is what matters, and tune that out and focus on what you're doing. And this is an important job, and a job that we need to be doing. And you know what? You're gonna get from all different sides, including sides you didn't even know could come after you, will be coming after you, and it's part of the job. With that said, we've also really tried to be mindful of how hurtful and demoralizing the backlash can be, especially for my colleagues who are women, especially for my colleagues who are reporters of color. They have endured racism, sexism, in like a volume unlike anything we've seen before. And we need to protect them and defend them, and also make sure that anytime any of my colleagues are being dragged on Twitter, I try to just reach out and ask, like, how are you doing? Like, what do you need? Especially if your integrity is coming under attack. It can be really difficult to go through that in the public eye. I hope that answers your question. Okay.
All right, so we are running out of time now. And so we'd like to say thank you so much for being here, for being a part of our class, for being part of UNL's family.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
And so, do you have any questions for our students that you'd like to ask?
Oh, that's a good question. I guess I hesitate to ask this one, but how many people regularly read the Washington Post? Sometime. Okay, all right, okay, good. That's good to see. And how many of you are looking to go into a journalism field, whether it's television, broadcast, audio, newspapers, magazines? Okay, awesome. I'm so happy to see that. I know it can be a difficult time to do journalism, but it's a really exciting time to do it, and so I hope you all stick with it.
Thank you so much, and please take Ms. Jenna Johnson.
All right, thank you guys.